Good afternoon. Welcome to the RV Repair Club and our Q&A going live. It's great to be back again. My name is Dave Solberg. I am the managing editor, and we have not done one of our question and answer sessions for almost a year now due to the COVID and all the turmoil that's happened in the last year or so. But it's great to be back. We did a gold event last week, and that went really well. All my RV shows have been canceled, so I've been a little rusty on some of the presentation, and so it's kind of nice to get back in front of the camera and talking with people. So I hope everybody out there is having a great Christmas week this week, staying safe, staying your social distancing. We are going to start off. The first question that's come in was a gentleman that has purchased an Allegro, and it looks like he has said, just got an Allegro 36LA 2014. He's trying to figure out how to read and activate the monitor control panel. All indicators have an X where it should say 1/3, 2/3, etc. The panel lights up, but we can't figure out how to get it to show the levels in the tanks. It's different than their old 2003 32-footer. So most of the manufacturers out in the market, what he's talking about is the monitor panel that will read the levels of your freshwater tank, your black water tank, your gray water tank. Typically LP is in there too, sometimes the charging system. And I'm not sure if he's got a diesel pusher, or 36LA probably is a diesel model, which doesn't, gas or diesel doesn't matter. It's just a lot of times a diesel will go a little higher line of some of the amenities they have inside. And most companies use Intellitech monitoring system that will have probes down in the inside of it. So with this one, without getting into, if everything's reading X, then you know it's not the probes in individual tanks, because it would be just one monitor or the other. In this one, it looks like he probably has some type of a short in either the ground wire, and most these are going to run off of 12 volt, the house batteries typically. The first thing I would do is I would hook up a battery charger. A lot of your functions inside an RV that operate on the 12 volt house batteries or deep cycle batteries require a certain voltage for them to work. For example, the furnace, if it gets below 10.5 volts, the fan will still run, but it won't run fast enough to lift the sail switch in it, and so the unit won't start. Same thing with the refrigerator. So I would imagine the monitor panel probably has some kind of a fail-safe or a safety switch. Wouldn't be safety as much, but a switch that says, okay, my batteries are low, I'm not getting enough battery power to turn this on. So the first thing I would do is I would actually either plug the unit in or connect a battery charger directly to your house batteries. And we've done a lot of videos on it. We've done blogs and talked extensively about your house batteries and sulfation in those batteries. And a lot of times they say, well, I'm plugged in, I'm charged up. Those batteries, if they're sulfated, they could show a charge right away, but within a matter of several minutes, depending on the load that's put on them, could drop to a point where they're not going to function. So the first thing I would do is I would check my battery power, the condition or level. I would put a battery charger on those to see if that made any type of a difference. If not, then you're looking at something in that monitor panel, and I would suggest contacting Allegro. Tiffin has a great owner relations department out there, a great service department. They can tell you if it's possibly a fuse. I'm not sure exactly what style they're using, but that's where I would start and go from there. Sorry, there isn't a magic button I could say you just hit this and it will reset it, but that's where I would go. So the next question we got in, Carl asks, my Suburban Furnace makes a popping sound while running. Still heats, but has a popping sound while running. What could this be? Probably what's happening with that, and I guess just to give a little background on how the furnace works. When the thermostat calls for heat, so you set the thermostat at whatever temperature you want. It hits that. It's going to send a signal down to the blower motor, to the module board first. And the blower motor, it's going to start that motor up. And as that motor spins, it's going to pull out exhaust from, inside your chamber. It's going to pull out any LP that may be still lingering there and pull that out. And then as that squirrel cage or fan blows, it's going to raise a sail switch, and it's just a small little switch that it has to get up to a certain height, and you'll hear a little click, and it will then tell the module board, okay, I have enough power, I have enough speed so that I can start in this furnace. So it opens up the gas valve, and that gas then goes through, and it does have a little orifice on the inside of that, and then as the burner ignition or the burner assembly lights, that heat, then the air flows over the top of it. The heat then goes past what's called a temperature sensor switch on the backside, so it doesn't get too hot, and then it goes into the coach, and return air comes back, and it just keeps cycling that way. So the first thing I would look at is to make sure that all your vents inside your RV are open and they're not covered. A lot of people like to put runners on the floor, for pets especially, and if you have any of those vents inside closed or covered, then you're not getting enough airflow coming through there, and that's going to back up on the inside. Typically, that's going to make the temperature sensor go off and open and shut the unit down. It not always does a popping, but there's just kind of this gradual progression that you need to follow and make sure everything is working properly. The second thing I would look at is go outside, make sure that your exhaust ports are open. There's mud daubers and certain spiders that love the smell of propane, and they'll weave a web in there. The mud daubers cake that up. Just make sure it's not obstructed, that you're getting good airflow coming in and out, because the popping sound in most respects is going to be some type of a poor mixture in your LP fuel to the air source. If both of those are okay, I would also check the 12-volt system, just make sure that it is up like we talked about beforehand. And then after that, you're probably looking at having to clean out the burner assembly. You may have some soot in there, again, and maybe a spider, the inside. So somewhere you're not getting the proper mixture, and it's building up a little bit, and then poof, inside of it. The other thing that it could possibly be is a lot of people mistake a popping sound for a clunking sound. And if you, as you get heat exchanges, the metal in your burner assembly or the metal in some of the plenums that are out there will pop a little bit. So you got to identify, is it in the actual furnace part, or is it some of the metal with temperature changes in the inside? But there's some great videos on our site on cleaning the burner assembly. There's also a class that goes in through the whole entire process of it. You have to see how comfortable you feel taking a gas line off and getting into that. So those are the steps that I would take for that. We have then the next question. I'm trying to install snap pads on my front jacks, but the jack pad foot on my RV is dished up slightly on the edge, and they will not snap in to the snap pads. Is there a trick that I can use? The back ones work just fine, but I can't get the front ones on. So you got a little bit of a lip. Normally, I would say probably what happened with that is somehow they got drug a little bit, something. And if you've got a little bit of a curling, or you said a dish up, what does this say? Dished up slightly on the edge of the pads. So if you got some kind of a cupping or scraping that came in there, I guess the first thing I would do is go in and take a little bit of a hand file or a slight grinder and just round those edges off or sand those edges. See if you can get that to smooth out a little bit. One of the best products I see out in the market is fluid film, a great lubricator. They put a little bit of that on. It might be that if you can start on the side that's dished and then push it in, and because basically what you're trying to do is get that pad on to give you a bigger footprint in that the leveling jacks on the bottom side of it. But if you can get in there and just shave that off a little bit, sand it off slightly, you should be able to get those on. Timothy asks, my furnace cycles when first starting the flame. Does this for 10 minutes, then runs normally. How can I correct it? So if it's cycling, then, again, we get back to how that furnace works, that the fan starts first without any kind of a burner assembly. Once that fan speed knows that it's okay, that it's got plenty of speed going through to lift that sail switch is going to open the gas valve. It's going to spark that. So if it's cycling, meaning it's starting up and then it shuts down, and then it starts up again and it shuts down, it could be that you've got a vent again inside somewhere that's closed. You need to have all those vents open, or most of them. You don't have to have every single one of them open. Sometimes you can get by with closing the one or two in the bathroom or bedroom, as long as you keep nice, good airflow going in the front. But make sure that they're not covered. If you have we call them elephant trunk type hoses, where instead of a plenum in the center running through like your home, you got these corrugated hoses that go through cabinetry, underneath the couch, those kind of places. Sometimes when people shove extra stuff under the couch or in those compartments, cabinets underneath, they pinch that hose, and so you don't have good airflow. And it might be that you're just getting enough of that till it warms up, and it senses that it's working fine. Again, we get back to the batteries. Now, the batteries are a real gremlin, and we see it a lot with the refrigerators too, where people say, well, it works fine for about 30 minutes or so, and then it shuts off. And then I wait for a while, and then it works fine again, and then it shuts off. And a lot of times what's happening there is you're hitting that little soft spot, we call it, or in the battery charging system. So your batteries are your converter, if you're plugged in, and this is the other thing too, I guess, check to make sure, does it do it both when you're plugged in and when you're dry camping? If you're plugged in and it doesn't do it, and it does it when you're dry camping, then it kind of lends me to think that those batteries are sulfated and they're kind of cycling themselves a little bit. If it does it when you're plugged in, one of the things that we see a lot of times is your battery's at 12.6 volts. It's got so many amp hours, 100 amp hours, whatever it happens to be. As it drains down about 50% of those amp hours out, that's when the converter kicks in. But what happens is we get down to a certain point where the converter won't kick in yet, but yet the furnace has a problem till it gets down to this point. The furnace shuts off until our converter kicks in, and then we've got battery power to make it go. Same with the refrigerator when we see that cycling like that. So I guess, again, the first thing I would do is when you first start up that, put a battery charger on. Again, see, does it do it in dry camping versus hooked to 120 volt? And then if it still does it when you're plugged in there, then somewhere you got a problem with either your sail switch or your temperature sensor starting to get weak. If after a certain point, maybe it's the wiring to it, maybe it's the probe on the inside of it, that once it warms up to a certain temperature, then they expand and contract with temperature sensors. And I've seen back, I don't remember what year it was, but I took a motorhome up training dealers, and I couldn't get the furnace to light. And so I ended up getting them a hotel. Next morning, I called down to customer service, and I said, the furnace won't light. And they asked me, well, what was the temperature? I said, well, it was about 0 degrees. And they said, well, that's a problem. It was too cold. And it's like, okay, that didn't make any sense to me. But they had an issue with the wiring in the thermostat at cold temperatures. It would start, and I don't know if it's expanding or contracting, whatever it was doing, but it would open basically during cold temperatures. And so it had to be up to a certain temperature. Well, they eventually fixed it. It was the thermostat issue. It wasn't the manufacturer. But so I do know that temperatures can open and close circuits like that. So take those steps, make sure all your vents are open, check your heating assembly, and then you're probably going to have somebody check the sail switch or the temperature sensor on the backside. Kevin says, do you know if I can run two 12-volt DC converters in parallel, or will this mess up how they top off the chassis battery? Thank you. From everything that I've read and talked with Progressive Dynamics and others, they do not recommend running converters in parallel. You can run generators that have converters in them because they're basically tying the two together. And one of the things that you mentioned to charge your chassis battery, those are only designed to charge the house batteries, not the chassis battery. That's going to be charged by the engine alternator while that's running or while you're driving. I guess what I would recommend is find out what kind of a converter you do have in your RV. I don't think you put the year down. No, I don't see that. And I guess one of the things that I would, recommend to the converter, I don't know why you would necessarily need to run two converters at the same time unless you have a very low output converter. Back in probably the late 80s, early 90s, some of the converters were very low. They only gave a small charge, and if you're using other stuff inside the unit, I've seen times where you could be plugged in. Winnebago had a model called the Landon that had all the bells and whistles in it and brought out one year. You could plug it into the campground source at a 30 amp source and literally drain the batteries because the converter could not keep up with for the battery usage with everything else being used inside the coach. So you may just want to go to a larger converter. Progressive Dynamics has some wonderful converters, Charge Wizard converters. There's several of them out in the industry now, and make sure you match them to the batteries that you're looking at. We have a lot of people starting to look at lithium batteries, and your standard converter is not going to charge those batteries much more than 75%. And so you got to match those two. So I would look at what kind of converter you got in there, and then check out and see if you may be able to go a little bit better, higher with that. John asks, we bought a 2016 33C Bounder. I have no driver console lights. I have checked the fuse, but still no lights. I guess with that one, those are tough ones to be able to do remotely until you can get in and actually see, basically check, test, follow every one of those wires in there. Now, one of the other things I would suggest is you not only have a set of fuses on the block inside the RV, but chances are with that Bounder, if I remember correctly, there's another block on the firewall on the inside of it, and it's got several different, not only fuses, but the small little block capacitors for start and for fuel and so forth. And it might be something in that. Otherwise, you're going to have to do it the old-fashioned way and pull the dash out and start putting the wire in and finding out, do you have a short somewhere? And that's one of the, probably the biggest challenges in the wiring systems in RVs, and we call them gremlins, is you've got so many wires that are grounded to certain points in there, and there's a lot of places you have to follow. The nice thing about, and I think Bounder, you said 2016, I believe it was, 2016, you should be able to get a set of wiring diagrams for that. That console would be a part that they put in. It wouldn't be part of the chassis typically, unless it's a diesel. And I don't think a 33C would be the diesel, but check and see if there's another set of fuse blocks on the front of the firewall before you start tearing into it. Mark asks, I'm brand new to RVing and just recently bought a slightly used Class B. Well, Mark, welcome to the RV world. You will enjoy it. I decided to install a 30 amp, 120 volt receptacle at home so that I could camp at home. Not knowing anything about any of this, when I plugged in a cheap volt reader, not a real meter, just something I plugged into a 120 outside in the van, it was showing me the voltage of 123. Does this matter? And it is supposed to fluctuate slightly as I plug in other devices. I just don't want to blow up my van. Well, first of all, Mark, I congratulate you for putting a 30 amp service in your home, in your garage to plug in. I see a lot of people bring their RVs to their house to get ready, not camping at home, but they want to get ready to go on their trip. So they plug it in to charge batteries, get the refrigerator to cool down, and they'll plug it into just an ordinary outlet inside the garage. And typically those are going to be about 15 amp plug-ins. And there's been a lot of problems with that. You're going to overload the circuit. I have personally seen 2 garages that have burned down because the wire got so hot, started something else on fire inside. So I applaud you for the 30 amp in there. The next thing is when you put a meter in it, the old way of describing electricity is we have 110 volt power, and that's not typically true. It's 120 volts. So anywhere from 115, I believe, to about 125 or so is normal. And I have somewhere here, I believe, in my bag of goodies, when we plug in, oh, where did it go? All kinds of fun stuff in here. You can tell it's been a while. Don't know where anything's at anymore. Well, I got the analog version. So there are some, this is a digital monitor here. You could also use something like the TRW, and let me grab that real quick here. This is kind of overkill here, but this is going to tell you exactly what you have, the voltage in there. And so one of the things, let's see if I got that. I believe I do. I'm going to plug this in, just show you what we got at our system. This is upside down. There you go. See, this is the system we set up inside, and it's a little hard to see, but that shows me I have 123 volts right here at my campground source too. So, and that's fine. You can get up, I believe, 100 and they say normally about 5% at least. So you can go high extreme with this. This is a surge protector that will also keeps a high surge, but if it goes below voltage, you don't want to go below about 110 is about the lowest you want to go to, and you'll still be able to run everything. But any lower than that, then everything is going to run sluggishly, and you're going to have problems with motors and capacitors and so forth, and air conditionings and other things. But you should be fine with that. There was another part of that question, was it? Supposed to fluctuate slightly when you plug in other devices, and it will do that. If you got a dedicated circuit, you'll see it draw just a little bit, but it shouldn't fluctuate a lot. But again, that surge protector is a good thing to have, and just make sure everything's protected with it. Okay, and Denny asks, should you rotate 6-volt house batteries as you do tires when they are reinstalled in the spring? And no. And the way the 6-volt battery works is you're going to take two batteries and you're going to hook them up in series, meaning positive to negative. That's going to give you a 12-volt bank. So no matter which way you have it, there is no one's working, the other one's not working. It's going to give you a 12-volt series in that. The more important thing, in my opinion, is number one, you want to check the fluid levels on those. 6-volt have a tendency to gas more and lose more acid inside, so you want those to come up just above the plates, just below the vent cap that's in that cell. The next thing then you want to do is make sure that you condition those batteries. If you just take them out in the wintertime and let them sit, then they're still going to sulfate. Even if you bring them into a heated garage, you want to get something that's going to condition them periodically, which is something like a battery minder. You get a lot of people that confuse that with a battery tender, it's just a little 2-amp charge. A battery minder actually will throw high impact waves into those batteries and break up sulfation. The same thing if you leave it hooked into the system, it's going to have a draw in that. Your LP leak detector, even if you hit the battery disconnect, the LP leak detector is wired around that, so it's going to draw those batteries down and drain them, and you will get sulfation. So, you don't need to cycle them rotate them like you do with tires. Which brings up another good point for those of you with motorhomes. Most motorhome manufacturers don't recommend rotating tires in the larger motorhomes. Only if you see excess tread wear, because you're not going to be able to switch them around like you would in the car, and it doesn't have the advantage of it. So most of our RV manufacturers motorized larger Class A's, and so don't recommend rotating. Alan asks, I want to change my water heater to an on-demand system. Any thoughts on this? Mine was the board furnace, would start but no heat. Mine was the onboard furnace, would start but no heat. If you want to change out your water heater to the on-demand system, we're seeing a lot of people going to that, mostly because of the new technology. In the past, it would take such a huge burner and power that it really didn't make sense. You know, you go to Home Depot or Lowe's or any of those stores and you start looking at residential style on-demand heaters, and you know the electric ones take so much power you couldn't do it in an RV. The LP ones still required a ton of battery power, and it wasn't really advantageous. But now we're seeing Furrion has a version that comes out. Truma, a company that has been big into a variety of different water heaters, and even this is a little LP leak detector that they came out with many, many years ago. But Atwood had one for a while. They got out of the business for a little bit, and they're coming back into it. So I would stick with one of the on-demand systems that is being designed by somebody in the RV industry, because they know your power that's needed for it. They know what your LP system is like, all the intricate things that have to do with an RV that don't pertain to the housing industry or residential side of it. You know, we see a lot of things that look like they came from the housing industry, moved into the RV stuff, but you know, there's some specifics that we need to understand when those products are brought in, where we're mixing LP with 12-volt systems with 120 volt, and we're letting them get down to 0 degrees in the wintertime in the northern states and up to 120 degrees at times when we let them sit out in the summer. So those are the companies that I would look at, and you know, from what I've seen, that they really do a nice job. And they can keep up with the water demand. That's the other thing, that when you're boondocking, you know, your typical water pump like this is going to give you about 40 psi. Older models are going to give you a lot less, and you want to make sure you have enough capacity or flow to get into that on-demand system as well to be able to supply your hot water. Don asks, I am a retired military and just purchased a 2006/7 30-foot Frontier Lexington Class B with only 25,000 miles on it. First of all, Don, I'd like to say thank you very much for your service. We appreciate it. The dinette lights, the center ones, won't illuminate, but the two outer lights next to each side work. I have changed the bulbs and it still does not work. I have checked continuity and that's okay. So I thought it would have been the fixture. After removal, I again checked continuity. It was fine. Okay, I'm stumped. On another note, I'm also a first-time RVer. Lots to learn. Thanks. Well, welcome to the RV world as well. So if you've got two lights above the dinette that don't work, check the continuity, and that's okay. So you know, we've done a couple videos on some of this stuff and checking lights. And I guess the first thing when you check continuity, I would pull the fixture itself out and hook it directly to the battery on the positive side. And with the older models like that, it doesn't matter. You can put positive to negative, negative to positive, and you know, it's just basically illuminating the light. It's causing resistance and it'll glare. So you put one side to the battery, and as long as you don't have LEDs in it, let me back up with that. The old incandescents and fluorescents will do that. But check your fixture itself. If the fixture works, then what's happened is somewhere in your wiring, typically the ground is going to go somewhere, you know, and have a short or an open, and more correctly, have an open in that line that's not allowing you to get it. Because one of the challenges with older units, and yours is 2003, I think he said, 2006. Okay. So maybe they ran dedicated lines. You know, one of the things we found for years is that when manufacturers put light fixtures and certain 12-volt stuff in, they would ground take the ground wire, put it to a chassis point or a frame or somewhere, and then you're relying on all those welds all around there to be good. So I would take the fixture out and check that, and if the fixture's good, if the fixture works, then it's somewhere in your wiring. And typically, it's easier to put new wiring, put a new ground wire in it. That's the second thing you could do, is you could take the fixture out, leave the positive in, and then put a new negative to the ground and just see. So that'll isolate, is it the fixture, is it the ground, or is it the positive that goes with it? And the two side lights might not be connected. So you probably have one wire that went up and was ganged to those two Dynet wires on the top. Don also asked, do you have any videos how to bring an RV Class C chassis out of winterization in the spring? I'm very new to this. And I do. And Class C, and you mentioned earlier you had a Class B. So we don't have a specific to the Class C at this point yet, but we have good blogs out there. We have a class, I believe, even, and we have several videos on de-winterizing, as I call it. The biggest thing is to bring it out, check for rodents throughout the whole thing. I'll just do a real quick run through on this, but you can get this off the website. You want to check for rodents all the way around, inside and out. Hopefully you had your batteries conditioned while you were at it there. Otherwise, you're going to need to get those batteries desulfated and charged up. If you used RV antifreeze in the system, then you'll want to put either city water fill or fresh water in the water tank and remove all the pink antifreeze that's in there. If you blew the system out with air instead, then you want to make sure you probably have a little bit of RV antifreeze in the water pump itself. Some of your chassis, and this is something you should check with, you said a Class B or a Class C, so you've got an engine chassis battery as well. If that went dead, check with your owner's manual and find out if there's a procedure to bring your computer back into sync. Now, my dad was notorious for this. He'd let his Braves sit out in the wintertime. Everything would die, go dead on it, and the spring would come in, and I'd have to go out and help him. And now I get to say, oh, now you never listened to me. But anyway, we'd have to put a jumper on it. And there was a procedure we had to do with that Chevy engine. It was on a workhorse chassis to get it to run up to RPMs properly. So we'd have to let it run for about 15 minutes at a certain idle, because you push the floorboard, the foot feed down, and nothing would happen. It would just because the computer lost all its settings. So you'd have to run it for about 15 minutes at a certain RPM, then you'd run it for another 5 or 6 minutes at another RPM, which is about 35 miles an hour, if I remember correctly, and go through those steps to get that to learn those sequences again. So check with your chassis manual and just see if you did let the batteries go dead, if there's a procedure for that. So basically, and one big thing about bringing a unit back in from de-winterizing is to make sure if you have an electric water heater that you put water in that water heater. If you start it up with nothing inside of it, you're going to burn that system out and you'll have to buy a new one. So check that, and check the videos we have online as well. There's a little more into it, and checking the sealants. You want to make sure that you didn't have any ice and snow if that's where you're storing your RV that made its way into somewhere and you've got leaks in the roof for the sidewalls or slide rooms. Okay, so Tony asks, what causes some of your lights to flicker sometimes? Been tied to service for over 6 months. Ooh, okay. Lights to flicker. Well, and I guess, Tony, need a little more information on which lights you're talking about. If they're interior lights, and I kind of need to also know, are they incandescent, fluorescent, LEDs? There are a lot of things. I remember the old fluorescent lights would flicker inside when you turned radios on, because the the interference that came in from those would make them flicker. I don't know why. It's something in the ballast or whatever powers that fluorescent tube or strip that's in there. Otherwise it's got to go back basically to the power that's coming to it. So those interior lights are going to run off the 12-volt house batteries. And it may be that you've got a loose wire at the fuse box for those. It may be that your batteries are fluctuating. Let me ask you this: does it happen when you're plugged in versus when you're boondocking? That way you can kind of tell, is the converter helping to keep those batteries up to charge, or are those batteries having problems with sulfation in it? So that is a tough one. To get in without really tearing into it and finding out exactly, what you've got, what lights, what types, and all of them, or just some of them. So give a little more information. Maybe we can go a little further on it, but that's a tough one without being right there. And I'm sorry you're in the service for 6 months. That shouldn't happen, but that's one of the things that RVIA is working on is technician certification, trying to get more technicians better trained into the industry. We saw a huge drop 2008 to 2011. The industry basically shut down, and a lot of those mechanics and technicians went off into other industries, other fields. And then when it came back robust as it has, it's hard to get anybody into the RV industry as a technician because they see it as such a roller coaster cycle. So RVIA has put together a certification program that they're trying to get more people into it. It's not a quick fix though. So hopefully, one of the things I guess I would do, and you didn't tell me what year the model was, but I would get your manufacturer involved. Fit's been in there for 6 months. They've got a technical support staff that should be able to help identify some of the issues they've seen in other things. So they could probably shed some light on that as well. David asks, can I store my inline water filters and use them more than one camping season? We mostly dry camp, so they are hardly used. I'm thinking the fridge or the freezer. Is there a danger of mold? Well, and then we had this last week when we did the gold session. We had somebody talking about it, and he was referring to inline filters, which we see something like this that basically just sits inline on the way to the freezer, the refrigerator. You can use these outside as well. Most of the time you are going to see people using the under sink Omnis like this. And I guess I would not recommend reusing water filter after you put the unit in storage, you've taken it out. You keep in mind you're using hard water from the campground sources, and even though it has to go through a certification process every year, you're going to get minerals in that. You're going to get some bacteria. I've seen some pretty nasty looking water that has sat for a couple months in places, and I think that the filters are cheap enough that I wouldn't trust using them unless maybe you ran some Clorox bleach diluted solution through them before storing them. So it's not only the mold, it's some of the bacteria and some of those minerals and what they'll do over a period of time. That's kind of why I recommend this. It's just an Omni filter, something that you can get at any home improvement store. Under the kitchen sink one, you can get a little larger ones for the outside. The nice thing about these is you're going to have just a filter inside here that costs about $2, versus some of the larger ones here that are, you're talking maybe $20, $30 sometime for some of those. So, I would recommend going with something like that. And again, if you're looking to use it, I definitely would try to figure out a way to flush it, but I generally throw them away and get a new one. I have a 2008 Keystone Springdale 25 to RDLS, and I have two questions. One, what is the best product to use for leaks in the rubber roof to reseal the edges? Number two, what is the best travel trailer cover with access to both doors and the slide out? So number one, what's the best thing to use for leaks on the rubber roof? And I think, a lot of people swear by Eternabond. Eternabond is a kind of a tacky tape that you can put on the edges, go all the way around it. What typically happens is the manufacturer is going to use a rubber membrane or a fiberglass on the top of it, and then at the edges they're going to put a self-leveling seal. And it's not necessarily a silicone, although it looks like silicone, but it's a sealing compound or component that's designed for that material. Well, when you get the temperature changes, the roofs and materials expand and contract. You get freezing temperatures, you get hot temperatures, those harden, they crack. So a lot of times you'll go up there, and if you have a leak, you'll see a really hard sealant on there. Sometimes they crack. So the first thing I would recommend before just going up and putting anything on there is go up, inspect it, clean it really well. There's some great cleaning products that Dicor makes and Protectol and others out there, and then inspect it. And there are times where you probably are going to have to take some of that old sealant off. If it's cracked and it's been gooped on there pretty good, before putting anything else on it, I would say take a heat gun and a plastic type of a paint scraper or something that's not going to gouge everything, but just at least get a good level surface to start from. Clean it up really good. Then you can use Eternabond or Dicor. You could also reapply that same sealant that is designed for it. I know at Winnebago we used a 331 application for the fiberglass that was used on that material. Dicor also makes a variety of products that are fantastic for sealing, that are just a wipe-on or roll-on type, kind of like a paint application that you could use. So I like the Dicor stuff myself. But again, I think the key is to get up there and prep that surface well before whatever you use on the top of it. Otherwise, it's not going to work. I need a water level. This was from our goal last week. Okay, Chris asks, none of the HDT videos I have seen so far mention anything about hooking up the trailer brakes. I know they are not air. So, questions he asks. So the trailer brakes on most of the trailers you're going to have out there are going to be electric brakes, magnetic brakes. And as you apply it, the magnet's going to push that brake pad out to the outside of it. So there's not a lot of setup that you can do other than your brake controller. That's kind of the important part of it. And typically your dealership's going to help you with that. We did do a couple videos on the trailer brakes themselves and how they operate. If you look at that, we pulled apart an axle on 26-foot Jayco, I believe it was, and showed the process and how they worked. But we will be doing some videos on the brake master itself and how to set that up, because you got a 1 through 10 setting on those, and you need to set the brake up according to the weight of that RV. And the big thing is you're trying to slow the RV speed down. You're not trying to stop the truck with those trailer brakes. And I see too many people setting them up way too high because they think, well, if my RV brake or my tow vehicle brakes fail, I want my RV brakes to stop the truck. And when you do that, you run the risk of sliding your tires and wearing them out too much. In normal driving conditions, they're going to stop and start to skid because they're set too high. The other thing that's even worse is that if you get on wet pavement or slippery roads or snow, you touch those brakes and they're going to lock up in the back and you're going to break loose, meaning sliding all over the place with that. So typically, what we do when we set up a brake, we'll go into a gravel road or a parking lot with a little bit of gravel on it, and we set them at about a 4 or a 5, and then we just let the unit kind of go in idle and set it to the point where when we touch the brakes, it slides a little bit on the gravel. And there's a lot of different processes for setting those brakes up. Some people like to do it to the point where they can feel a little bit of a tug on the truck itself on regular pavement, and that's more like a feel for it. So I would say if you start at a 4 or a 5 and you can get the tires to just slide, there and go up and down, you'll find a point where when I apply the brakes, it doesn't, and then you go a little higher, and then it does, and you find that sweet spot in between it. But we will be doing a video on it. We haven't shot video since last February, actually, with all the stuff going on. But we do intend after the first of the year here, when we start getting some weather, the brake setup one is, we're up in the upper Midwest in Iowa. So luckily we haven't had snow yet, but it's been pretty cold. So we will get those out. One of the things I just want to make sure everybody realizes, there is a link on the page here to see where it's at, to our how to buy a used RV. We're getting a lot of people coming into the market with the pandemic that don't want to fly and stay in hotels and all that kind of stuff. And RVing is just exploding, but you want to be careful. You want to make sure you look at certain points when you're buying a used RV, and you can get that link right here on the site. So we have Jason, Chris, there he is. Robert asks, hi Dave. Hi Robert. 1995 Terry 30G, a few months ago, I had a lightning strike in my yard that blew out the thermostat fuse, and neither AC or furnace will run. Have replaced the fuse and still nothing. Thoughts? Well, so the AC and the furnace operate a completely separate system. So there wouldn't be one fuse that you would use to run either one of those two. The furnace is going to run off LP and 12-volt power, meaning the house batteries. And so the way the furnace operates is it's going to have the thermostat. It'll be wired to your DC fuses in the DC fuses in your monitor panel. And then the thermostat calls for heat, like we talked about beforehand, and will run the squirrel cage and light the blower assembly or the burner assembly. So the roof air conditioner then is going to run off of 120 volt power. It does use 12 volt power just for the monitor panel and for the compressor up on the top, but it basically runs off of 120 volt power, and it has a circuit breaker, not a fuse, that's in that. So if neither one of those runs, then I guess the first thing I would look at is check for power at the circuit breaker. And are you using it? So are you trying to use the air conditioner on 120 volt or on generator? If you're trying to run it on generator, there are two circuit breakers on the generator that could have tripped that power that fuse. Everything else is working. I would check everything else in the coach is running off of 120. My refrigerator, my outlets, all that stuff, is that all working? So then I know my air conditioner should work. Check the power at the circuit breaker. If you have power at the circuit breaker, then you've fried something up in the air conditioner on the 120 volt side. Now the furnace, on the other hand, if that's not working, then you're going to have to check for power. There's also a fuse at the furnace itself. So one of the things I guess I would recommend is to go in and take a look at our furnace class, and it will show you all these steps in troubleshooting on, if it doesn't start, check for this, check for this, check for this. So there's a variety of steps in there, and you do have a fuse in that module board in the furnace itself. So just checking the fuse on the circuit panel isn't enough. So I have a 2011 Winnebago Via here in Georgetown, Texas, and the refrigerator has stopped cooling. So we don't have a problem up here with the refrigerator not cooling. We just open the doors on the outside and it's perfect. So anyway, the interior light comes on but no cooling. What are the best options? New refrigerator or replace the cooling unit? So, before you start jumping into replacing the cooling unit or replacing the furnace, you want to do some diagnostics on what's happening. If the light's coming on, then we know we got 12 volt power coming into that unit of some sort. So the first thing I do with any appliance in the RV that runs off of either 120 volt or LP system is you try it on both modes of operation. Now, typically with the unit, and I don't remember if you said what, you've got 2011 Winnebago, so you probably have a Norcold with a freezer on the top and the refrigerator on the bottom, and it starts off with the switch says auto or LP. And when it's on the automatic switch, it wants to start on and run off of 120 volt power. It's called a default set. So if I'm plugged into campground source, it's going to try to start on the LP, on the electrical system. If that source gets pulled for any reason or stops, it will automatically switch over to light on the LP side. So if I'm out sightseeing and the campground source trips, then my refrigerator doesn't just stop working. It automatically switches over. So first thing I do is I put it on the LP side. Does it start on the LP side and cool? If it does, then we know we've got a 120 volt problem. In that case, then we look at the circuit breaker, we look at the module board, and if we're getting power into it. If it starts on 120 volt power and cools and not LP, then we know we have an LP issue somewhere, whether it's low batteries, whether it's the module board, there's a fuse inside that unit itself. So there's some great videos on the website. We've gone into every one of these. There's a class, but there's also individual videos on if it's not cooling, check this, 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 and this. The only way you can tell if it's not starting and not even starting to cool or any starting up, and just the light comes on inside, it's not the cooling unit itself. It's something before that, because all the cooling units there's no moving parts in it. And here's how the refrigerator works. Whether you're on an LP or heat, you've got a vessel that has liquid in it. It's got hydrogen, ammonia, sodium chromate, and water in that. And that goes down into your burner assembly area. And if you're on LP, it has a flame. If you're on 120 volt power, it's just got a heating element. That heats up that solution really, really hot, so it turns into a vapor, and it goes up the cooling unit, and it flashes through the evaporator coils up in the top of it. And that flashing literally pulls heat out of that freezer compartment. And then it comes back together and it goes through the condenser side and the refrigerator part and goes back down. So it just keeps cycling. There's no moving parts whatsoever. But if you don't get it to start even, it's not the cooling unit. It's something in the module board or in the monitor panel. So before I start replacing the cooling unit itself or even a new refrigerator, let's find out what are the steps. So check out the website. There are, I know, at least a dozen videos on the refrigerator, and we use the Norcold. It's an older version than what you have, but then there's also the class that goes through the same thing. So we should be able to identify where that problem's at. A lot of times something very simple, so check those out before you jump all in. I have a 2006 Monaco Knight. The main slide out is hydraulic and opens and closes unevenly. One cylinder is faster than the other. Is this due to air in the system? It could be air in the system, but I think with your unit, it's probably a power gear system, which with a hydraulic system like that, there's synchronizing valves in those as well. You could have a leak in the system somewhere that is providing air into it. Power gear is now owned by Lippert, and Lippert has a fantastic customer service department, owner relations department, and it's very possible it's just an adjustment in the power gear system itself. And we haven't done a video on the power gear as of yet. We've been trying to get our hands on a model locally that has done those. Again, sometimes logistics of shooting and trying to get the variety of different models that's out there. Over the years, we've had Quickie and HWH, and Lippert now owns about everybody out there except HWH. But the power gear, Newmar had their own proprietary slide, so it's hard to blanket everything out there. But we're trying. But I would suggest getting a hold of Lippert on their power gear side and see if you can't get the owner's manual for that mechanism, and it will show you how to adjust. Some of those have just a simple adjustment side to side, so you can pull the one side of the room out a little further, because it's rack and pinion arms that are pulling that out. Roger asks, hi, we recently purchased a 2021 Thor Omni BH35, and on the maiden voyage in the mountains of Colorado, we experienced a pronounced low humming sound in the Southland transfer switch after the furnace shut off. The only way to reset was by powering down, unplugging from shore power, then starting the process again. Is it common for the transfer switch to make a noticeable deep humming sound and vibrate? And so what he's talking about in the transfer switch, I'm assuming, is that you have when you're hooked to shoreline power, your power cord comes up into a automatic transfer switch, ATS switch. And I'm not familiar with the Southland but Progressive Dynamics makes them, and a variety of other people. And what it does is it senses if your power is coming from the generator or from the campground source. And if so, it literally switches in that box, so you don't have to physically take your cord out and go plug it into the generator outlet, which is called a J box. A lot of the older units and cheaper units, you physically have to go plug and unplug that. It's not common for it to hum like that. And if it's a 2021, I would first of all contact your dealership to make sure they document the issue with that. There's probably getting some kind of resistance in that box that is not normal. And if you can't get a hold of your dealer, or the other option, in my opinion, would be to call the company. And you said it was a Thor, and again, Thor is a wonderful company. They're the number one manufacturer of RVs out in the industry, motorized, actually RVs in the industry, and get it documented, because you're still under warranty, and that is something you want to make sure that somebody has documented, knows about it. So if it takes a little bit for it to get resolved, that you're able to do that. Lloyd asks, how hard would it be to put a Furrion camera over your travel trailer door? The challenge would, and Furrion's owned by Lippert, and they typically are going to operate off a 12-volt power source. So if you want to put a camera up above the door, the only real challenge is, where am I going to get power from? Up in that area, you don't want to really go through the lights. If you find any wiring that are for lights up there, they're going to be switched down at the bottom. So you really want a dedicated line. So the challenge you're going to have is to put that camera up there and find inside some way of getting a power source. If you can do it to a place where maybe it's off just a little bit to the side, where you can bring the wiring in back into cabinetry. Otherwise you're going to have to find some kind of a small channel. I've seen where people will add something, and then you can go to Home Depot or Lowe's and get that little, it's got a adhesive back to it, and it's just a channel that you can bring your wiring into, because you're not going to be able to get it through the side of the wall, because you probably have block foam insulation already in there. So that's about the only challenge. Now, I do see a lot of people that are starting to use like the Ring, and there are other cameras out there. I'm not sure what you're looking at doing and being able to see something. I see some people even use trail cameras that operate off of a 12-volt portable battery. The smaller little double A's and things like that. So there are some options out there. But again, if you want to put the Furrion in, you're going to have to find a power source to put that. Okay, we got about time for one more question, I believe. Is that Lloyd? And we do have one more question. You can mention, that's not a question, but mention the download again. We've got a download that we have a deal on how to buy a used RV, some things you want to look at before you do that. We are going to be doing this next month, so make sure you look for that. We also have purchased a 1996, I believe it is, 23-foot RV that we are going to be renovating, and that's kind of exciting. So we'll start to shoot on some of that stuff next month, and look for that out there. Again, make sure you get some questions ready for next month. We'll be back again, and everybody have a wonderful Christmas. I think we're out of Yep, we're out of questions there. Appreciate your coming. It's great to be back. Have a safe Christmas. Do your social distancing. As my wife says, wash your hands, wash your hands, wash your hands. Have fun, everybody. Thank you very much.